Hello, class. Today we are going to be going over some of the stories about the experience of minority groups during the Second World War. First, we'll talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first black military aviators in the U.S. Army Air Corps. The U.S. Army Air Corps was a precursor to the Air Force. They trained at the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, and they flew more than 15,000 missions in Europe and North Africa. Their impressive performance earned over 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and their success led to a push for the eventual integration of the armed forces. The Tuskegee Airmen faced a variety of obstacles in their fight to participate in the war, one of which was the racist preconception that African Americans were unable to fly and operate sophisticated aircraft. This aside, eventually there was the implementation of a program to train black pilots. This was located in Tuskegee, Alabama, home of the Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington. Nearly all trainees were college graduates or undergraduates and came from all over the country. They included pilots, mechanics, instructors, and other maintenance and support staff. Of the missions flown by the Tuskegee Airmen, initially they flew in second-hand planes that were less advanced than their German counterparts. Despite this, they still were able to prove themselves in combat and were remarkably effective, and eventually started serving alongside white pilots and boasted an exceptional record and outperforming many other units. Eventually, after proving themselves, they received more advanced planes and painted the tails red, earning the nickname of the Red Tails. They escorted bombers over Europe, supporting the push to Germany. Native Americans also exhibited a high rate of enlistment in the armed forces. Eventually, many of them were recruited as code talkers. Code talkers were Native Americans who used their tribal language to send secret battlefield communications. The most famous and well-known of these were the Navajo code talkers in the Pacific, who used their traditional language to send coded messages to troops. Many other native nations also served as code talkers, such as the Cherokee and the Comanche. Ironically, many of these recruited as code talkers had experienced growing up in boarding schools which had attempted to assimilate native people and would punish them for speaking their traditional language. The Native American code talkers would go through basic training as well as specialized training to develop and memorize a unique military code utilizing their traditional language. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers would deliberately target radio men. This made code talkers a particularly dangerous job, as they were often prime targets for the enemy. Code talkers served vital roles during D-Day and the Battle of Iwo Jima, with the 5th Marine Division signal officer, Major Howard Connor, stating, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." There was also a unique struggle faced by Mexican Americans during the Second World War. Discrimination in the military was still strong, but Mexican Americans still joined in huge numbers. Over 300,000 signed up to join the armed forces, and the Mexican American population in Los Angeles made up a large portion of volunteers for the city. This didn't stop discrimination at home, though. In the summer of 1943, Los Angeles exploded into what was referred to as the Zoot Suit Riots. Zoot suits were a style of dress adopted by Mexican American youth as a symbol of rebellion. You can see an example of a typical zoot suit style here on the right. Many affluent whites viewed the zoot suit wearing youth as menacing street thugs, gang members, and rebellious juvenile delinquents. The Zoot Suit riots began when 11 U.S. sailors in Los Angeles reported that they had been attacked by zoot suit wearing Mexican Americans. In response to this, 50 sailors from the U.S. Naval Reserve in Los Angeles marched through downtown LA carrying clubs and other weapons and attacked anyone seen wearing a zoot suit or other racially identified clothing. Full-scale riots exploded in the days after. Mobs of servicemen, civilians, and off-duty police officers marched into minority neighborhoods and attacked any person of color. Local papers framed the violence as a vigilante response to an immigrant crime wave, and those arrested were generally any Latinos who would fight back. The riots didn't die down until eventually U.S. military personnel were barred from leaving their barracks. Japanese Americans also volunteered in high numbers at the outset of the war. Many of them were appalled by the attack on Pearl Harbor. These second generation Japanese Americans, known as Nisei, viewed themselves as more American than Japanese, as they had more cultural ties to America. They formed a group known as the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was activated and composed pretty much entirely of Nisei, second generation Japanese Americans. They arrived in Europe in 1944 and fought against Germans encamped across Italy. They later participated in the invasion of southern France and liberated French cities from Nazi occupation. Today, they are remembered as the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. military.